I know this is a very mixed crowd. It involves most of the peoples that have melted and mixed here in the Americas, but my concentration is on Africa and on the African American. I shall make mention of one remarkable Hispanic scientist who is major in the space program at NASA, and I also shall make mention of a major contribution to world civilization from the quarter of Asia. But my main concentration has been on Africa. I was born in Guyana, South America, where I spent my first 24 years, but I spent most of my studies doing work on African civilizations. I also spent a dozen years in Europe, both Western Europe and Eastern Europe. I speak Hungarian, English, and no longer French, but I also speak Swahili, no longer, and a number of other languages, because I have lived everywhere in the world except Asia, and I didn't need to live in Asia because 2% of the population of my country is Asiatic. My concentration today will be on blacks in science, ancient and modern. This is a vast subject, far greater than you imagine, but I will concentrate solely upon African invention in inner Africa, that is Africa south of the Sahara, and then deal with the African American science and invention. I've been extremely fortunate in that I have been allowed in the major labs of this country. I've actually sat in a spaceship that is being built, and I've also was invited by NASA to witness the first blast off, or rather the blast off of the first black American into space in August 1983. I've also had a chance to be in many of the Bell Labs, and Bell Labs is the largest private research facility in the world. The contributions of African Americans to the science of this country is incredible. This gives you an idea of a city in the United States. Everything in this city that you see on this map is invented by an African American. The contributions of African Americans, as I say, is remarkable. When I went to NASA in 1981, I was not aware of any black in space outside of Darth Vader. In fact, I did not know there were any African Americans at all operating in this field, so I was very surprised to learn that the leading black at NASA is the man who was actually in charge of more than 1,000 of our scientists. He was in charge, Major Gillum IV, of the first space shuttle. Even the Russians, who are in advance of us in certain respects in terms of rocketry, and the Russians have robots on the moon and things like that. The Russians did not send up men after they lost. They had a tremendous tragedy where they lost 3 of their astronauts. They decided not to send up men anymore, but they have gone to more planets than we have, and they have also incredible rocketry and space platforms and stations which are in advance of ours. But even the Russians did not have a space shuttle, a reusable machine that goes up like a rocket and comes down like an airplane. And the man who was in charge of the first space machine that can do that was a black American, Major Gillum IV. He was the director of the Dryden Flight Research Center. And because of my work with NASA, Curtis Graves, who was deputy administrator of the space education program, I was invited by NASA and flown from Teterboro in New Jersey onto Andrews Air Force Base and then on to Cape Kennedy to witness the blast off of the space shuttle. That was an awesome event. Now, you may have seen it on television, but it is nothing like what you see on television. There are certain films, as you know, you can't watch on television. You have to actually have the huge screen in order to get a sense of what really happened. I was standing on that desert about 7 years ago, and I was standing there about 2 o'clock in the morning, and rain began to fall. Now, NASA did not tell us to bring raincoats. I was in my best suit like a fool, standing there in the rain. We were so excited I was not aware of the rain. I was terribly excited, and there is this tremendous machine standing there in the desert. Now this machine, standing on its scaffolding, is like a great skyscraper. You have never seen anything like that. We are 5.5 miles away from the machine. That's the nearest we are allowed to get to that machine. And yet it looks like a skyscraper. You can understand what is involved there. Those machines do not cost millions, they cost billions of dollars. In order to leave this planet and get into space, you have to achieve a speed of 24,000 to 25,000 miles an hour. You can understand what kind of force it needs to jet you out of the Earth. So we are standing there waiting for this machine to go up into space, and there is this great skyscraper, and there is this illuminated smoke all over the machine, and then comes a great voice over the desert, starting a countdown, and they stop at 20. They announce there's a problem. Now that machine has about 1 million parts. If one valve goes wrong, trouble. A valve went wrong. They check it out in a few minutes, they have it corrected, because there's an incredible brain there picking up everything. It can tell what is happening where in that spaceship. They correct it. And then they start again, and they stop again at 20, another problem. Well, the second time I looked around to see where I could jump in case the problem becomes really serious. Because 5.5 miles is not enough if that thing explodes. You're having there about 1 million gallons of gas, equivalent to 1 million gallons of gas. An explosion like that is not a joke if it is not controlled. So there comes a little red helicopter spinning above our heads, checking for various things. What would happen if that machine had to come down by itself? And you look around and you find there's no way to hide. The only thing you can do is just jump into the sand. They start to count again, and then they stop at 10. And then they announce that that's it. Once they start to count again, the computers take over. They cannot stop it. And then they start to count again. And everybody starts shouting excitedly, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And when we hit 0, there was an awesome blast. I have never seen or heard anything like that in my life. I would not like to hear it again, because my ears are not like your ears. I grew up in Guyana, and although Guyana is no jungle, 85% of it is. My country is larger than Britain, Scotland, and Wales put together. Its jungle is larger than any single jungle in Africa. And I was born in the city as a baby, but when I was still a baby, my mother and father divorced, and I went with my father into the jungle. My father was put in charge of everything in that jungle by the British. He was superintendent of all road and river transport going into that jungle. So I spent from babyhood to 14 in that jungle. There is no African of modern consequence who spent more time in deep jungle than I have. And I'm not talking about forest or woodland. I'm talking about the jungles you see in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And the kind of air you develop is such where you have to make a distinction, an instant lightning distinction, between the cracking of a twig and the movement of a snake 6 feet away. Otherwise you wouldn't survive very long. In the little village, town area perhaps, but as you go through those forest trails, you cannot see snakes. Snakes have chameleon qualities. They blend with trees and vines. Therefore you have to hear them. You have to hear the slightest movement of a snake, and you have to distinguish those movements. Your eyes have to be so trained that when you are in your raft or in your canoe and you look out into that water, you have to be able to tell from its color, its swiftness, its smoothnesses, its corrugations, whether you are in deep current or whether you are in shallow currents. If you jump out of that boat without knowing what kind of current you're jumping into, you may not jump into the boat again. So all of these things made me very sensitive, so that when that blast hit the ground, that blast is so powerful, it kills everything 500 square yards away. Every worm, every bird, every fly dies instantly because the blast shatters the organism. It is like the hitting of a dozen bombs, huge bombs. It shakes the earth. And then comes a great blast, a blast so great that the light runs for 700 miles in every direction. You can read a newspaper for 1 minute by the flash of that blast. And then comes this great fire on the ground. And then you see the spaceship going slowly upwards. And then it turns slightly on its side as if it's going to fall back into the Atlantic. And then comes a little red booster rocket slipping slowly out of the body, the great mother ship, and it falls back down into the Atlantic, and off went Guyan Bluford, the first black American in space. He wasn't the first black in space because the Russians had beat us to that. The Russians had sent a black Cuban into space before America. But it wasn't so much the blast off, the drama of the movement of that spaceship. It was the drama of the day before, because the day before I met a young man, younger, I believe, than anyone in this room. He came to a lecture, at least when he came to my lecture, he was younger than anyone in this room. His name is Anthony Trusty. He won the prize. He won the prize for sending the first ant colony into space. Now, Trusty, I believe, did not have any great passionate interest in science when I spoke. I had spoken to this school in Camden sometime in the early 1980s before I brought out my book, BlacksInScience Ancient and Modern. And it excited students, it particularly excited him, and he decided, I told him that the cargo bay of the shuttle has room for amateur experiments. And so he got ideas soon after that he wanted to send an ant colony to space, got some friends together. Eventually they got help. And now every one of those boys and girls who were involved in that experiment have science scholarships. That school, which had a 2% interest in science, developed a 52% interest in science. We are living in a world, whether you become involved in science or not as a career, make no mistake, we are living in a world that will become more and more complex. In 1982, Bell Labs announced that for the first time, there are more computers on the earth than people. That happened in 1982. There are more computers on this planet than people. Therefore, you have to become aware of the fact that we become more and more involved. And whether you become scientists or not, that's not important. I'm not a scientist. I am fascinated by science. My brothers are scientists. One of my younger brothers invented something new in television. I could never become a scientist because I do not understand mathematics. That has been a great distress for me. I got 6 out of 100 in geometry. But I was always fascinated, and I was the first person to write the first authoritative work on blacks in space science. It is because of that that NASA invited me, and now I have become the chief speaker to scientists at NASA in various locations, acquainting them with early African science, of which very few people know anything. But the important thing was to listen to the work of the great black scientists, because on that day there appeared all the great black scientists at NASA, including a Hispanic woman, Patricia Cowens, who has transformed the medical space program. Patricia Cowens is from Brooklyn, and Patricia Cowens, by the way, has invented a machine that they say quantifies yoga. Now, there's a difference between certain types of Asian exercise and Western exercise. We love muscles. We weight lift, we do all sorts of things that tighten our muscles and puff our chest up. But there are certain things we have not learned to control. We cannot control our heart. The yogis can. They can tell the heart to go down. You slow down. Go up. Even in some cases, though I haven't seen it, and I have questions there, they could stop it. Okay? But whether they could stop it or not, they can slow it down and carry it up. They can also do that with blood pressure. Those things are known in Western physical science as involuntary things that you're not supposed to have control over. We now have learned how to control those things. You can exercise in 6 weeks using her machine and train yourself to say blood pressure go down at command. Heart movement go down. Some of us need that. I do. Because my life is racing at the point where if it doesn't slow down, I'm not going to be here much longer. But so that these things which you may think are irrelevant because they're involved in this great barren space of the universe, they also have effects on us in the modern world on our planet. Many of these things have such effects. Because when you're in space, space is an incredibly beautiful thing. It's not like here you're on Earth and you go outside, the grass is green. When you go out in space, all the colors of the world are there. When you look back at the seas, the incredible blues and greens and the marvelous magic of the universe. There are worlds, millions and millions of worlds spiraling out there. This is just one spinning star. And when you come out of your spaceship, once you're attached to it, you can walk in the air, you can fly in the air, you can swim in the air, you can somersault, you have no weight, you're not light as a feather, you're lighter than a feather. You have absolutely no weight. The reason why we have weight is because we are on a spinning star. If we make like that, we come down immediately. If you do like this on the moon, you go through the roof, because you only have 1/5 the gravity you have on Earth. But the reason why we are nailed to the Earth is because we have masses of pounds of pressure in every square inch of our body that ties us to the Earth so that we don't fall off. But when you go into space, that disappears. So if you get up from your seat and you're not locked down, you float through the cabin. You go to brush your teeth, the toothpaste floats away. You go to comb your hair, and if you let go of the comb flies away. So but then comes something more serious. That's fun. But then sometimes your blood floats. You're sitting down in your space machine, and then suddenly the blood starts to float from your legs and balloon up into your head. So you have to learn a special science. You have to learn to control body functions which you take for granted in space. Now, blacks have done incredible things in this field. For example, Major Gregory, who is now Colonel Gregory, and who became quite a friend of mine at NASA, he's our leading technical astronaut. Barring none, he is our leading technical astronaut. He is the man who commanded the spaceship that we sent up last year in order to bring into space the most delicate reconnaissance satellite. He was not only a commander of the spaceship, he was the first black to pilot the spaceship, and he's responsible for major breakthroughs in space. He is the man who was chosen to redesign the brain, the cockpit of our space shuttle in the 80s. He is also the man who's responsible for one of the breakthroughs in aeronautics. For example, I spend most of my life in airplanes. In February, for example, I fly into classes and I fly out. I mark my papers on the plane. Every day I'm in an airplane. Now, I don't like flying. I used to enjoy it about 6 years ago, until one day we were flying into Flint, Michigan, and it was ice. But I love snow. In my country, there's no snow. I never saw snow until I was 24. So whenever I see snow, I see Christmas, because the only time we ever have any vision of snow is at Christmas time. They send us artificial Christmas crystals to put on our Christmas tree. So whenever I see these ice crystals, I see Christmas. So I associate ice with merriment. So when I see snow, I get merry. Well, that was the last day I got merry seeing snow. Because we were coming down into Flint, Michigan, And we were in a snowstorm, and I was feeling very happy, snow all around the airplane. And we were almost on the tops of the trees, and then suddenly the plane lunged violently upwards. People screamed, the woman behind me vomited. And then about a quarter minute later came the voice of the captain, and I don't know how they manage it. These guys are cool. Sorry about that. We just couldn't see the runway. That thing frightened the hell out of me. How could he, bringing down a machine heavier than a house, heavier than 10 houses? Those machines are not ordinary machines. And he's bringing this machine heavier than 10 houses, and he's in a snowstorm and he cannot see the... I didn't know you had to see anything. I thought at a certain point the computer takes over and brings the plane down. Well, now we have that. Colonel Gregory, the leading black astronaut in the space program, has invented a micro-instrumentation landing system. A computer locks the plane from the ground and brings it down on the point of a pin, whether the pilot is dead, blind, or drunk. Now, it hasn't been introduced as yet, so I have stopped traveling by windows. Okay, I sit in the aisle, and as soon as I hear any kind of great turbulence, I go to the bathroom, because I have noticed that when they crash, the tail is intact. I don't know if it would help. But we also have other things that Gregory is responsible for, but we have Bob Sherney, the engineer, the black engineer at NASA, who flies in an extraordinary machine. It's known as the 09 aircraft. And it flies, they call it the vomit comet at NASA. It flies a parabolic curve and achieves weightlessness. No other airplane achieves weightlessness. Okay, and this machine achieves weightlessness. He spent a lot of time in that machine, and he has also invented the first space toilet. Now, you may think that that's insignificant, but in space, if you go to the bathroom, it doesn't go down, it goes up. So you have to invent a special machine to deal with that problem. So space has created a whole new range of inventions. And then you have the leading black woman at NASA, Dr. Christine Darden. She is a very brilliant woman. She's in charge of our hypersonic research, in case you don't know what that is. We are flying not only faster than sound, we are trying to fly several times the speed of sound. We achieve it in our bombers. We are not allowed to do that with our airplanes beyond a certain point. The Concorde, for example, which is made by the British and the French, flies several times the speed of sound, but we do not allow it to do that across the United States. No plane is allowed to fly across the continental United States beyond a certain speed, because the shock, the sound shock, is so great that it can shatter windows and to some extent damage eardrums for miles around. As we hit the sound barrier, there's a tremendous explosion. It's known as sonic boom. There are great waves coming from the wings of the airplane, and these create a bubble which bursts. Dr. Christine Darden has taught us how to crinkle the bubble. She is reshaping the nose and wings of airplanes so that we can fly much faster than the speed of sound, just at the roar of a great wind rather than with the thunder that we get coming out of these planes. Planes are flying very fast. The Russians startled us when they first appeared in the Asian theater. We would pick out a Russian MiG and we would aim at the Russian plane and fire. And then we would find out, although we fired right where the plane was, it didn't hit the plane because the Russian planes were flying faster than bullets. So bullet could not get them, because by the time the bullet came close, the plane had disappeared. We have planes like that now. We have bombers that can fly 4 times the speed of sound. But to bring that into modern aircraft, the aircraft we will fly by the end of this century, we will be able to fly so fast that we could get anywhere on this planet in 45 minutes. Okay, you could leave New York at 7 o'clock in the morning and arrive in Los Angeles at 5 o'clock, 2 hours before you left. Of course, you know there's a time change. So these are exciting developments. Make no mistake about it. We are entering an age that is unbelievable. If you see some of the machines that have been invented that nobody knows about except a few people, because they're not yet commercialized, they're not in general, they're not for general consumption. These things are transforming our lives. And African Americans are at the heart of these breakthroughs. We have quite a number of other African American scientists. And then I went into Bell Labs to study what African Americans were doing at Bell Labs. And I can mention all of these things, like a friend of ours here who's doing the videotape is a very close friend of James West, who has transformed the microphone. And he's the co-inventor of foil electrets, which we use in some of our microphones. We have, and these three scientists at Bell Labs in New Jersey have done something that puts them right out there on the very cutting edge of communications technology. We have something now known as glass fiber light guides. These are things as thin as human hair, through which information is coded in pulses of laser light and sent flying through almost at the speed of light through these things. This is the major thing now in telecommunications. 3 black scientists at Bell Labs have taken us further than anyone else in this field. It was Thomas Cannon, for example, who, Bill Northover first of all, who taught us to stretch a 4-foot rod of glass for 6 miles, as thin as human hair. He gave us the mathematics. He made us look again at glass, understand it afresh, its properties, its capacities. Another black American at Bell Labs in New Jersey, Thomas Cannon, he actually was put in charge of manufacturing all the tools that were necessary to put these light guide cables under the streets of our city. He first tested it in Chicago. And another African American, Alfred Richardson at Bell Labs in New Jersey as well, he wrote the first guidebook for the world teaching us how to lay these light guide cables on the ocean floor. He went with the Bell cable ship, and he also invented a laser alarm to tell us when the light guide twisted and was in danger of breaking. So that these are not just, it's not just in 1 or 2 fields. In many of these fields, for example, how many of you are aware of the fact that 6 African American scientists worked on the Einstein on the atomic bomb? One of them I interviewed, Dr. Lloyd Quarterman, in this book. He died about 3 years ago. Dr. Quarterman was the man who taught us how to change uranium-235 into uranium-238. These were critical things. That's how we beat Hitler to the bomb. We managed to capture some of their work, but the breakthrough was made here by remarkable men, not just Oppenheimer. You would see films on Oppenheimer, but there are men behind the scenes, black men like Dr. Quarterman, who was granted a special certificate of appreciation by the United States government for his work on the atomic bomb. You never hear of these men. By the year 1913, more than 1,000 inventions were patented by African Americans, and that is an extremely difficult thing, because in the 19th century, nobody who was a slave or a descendant of a slave was allowed to patent an invention. Very few black free men patented inventions. Sometimes blacks had to patent their inventions on the lawyers or under their slave holders or ex-slave holders. They could not. There was a law passed in 1876 by the Attorney General of that time, Jeremiah Black, saying that a patent was a contract between the government and its citizen, and that since a black slave was not a true citizen, he could not patent an invention. In spite of that, African Americans patented inventions that were to affect the life of America in every major field. You see the electric light there. You've heard of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was a genius. It is true that he did pioneer in electricity, but Edison could not burn the light for more than a day. Edison lacked a critical thing that would make light practical and universal. It was a black inventor, Louis Latimer, who gave us the carbon filament so that the light could burn and burn and we can use its incandescence without it burning out. In other words, we can get that incandescence and brightness without the kind of heat that would destroy the filament. It was Louis Latimer who lit New York. The lighting of this city was done under the supervision of an African-American, Louis Latimer. He was taken to London and he lit London for the first time with electric light. We know nothing about that. It is as if it didn't happen because it doesn't appear on television, it's not in our films, it's not in our books. These things are very important. They're not just important to blacks, because one of the grave problems we face as we enter the 21st century, and note this, we are living in a shrinking world in which racial animosities and confrontations have no place. These things, if they do not shrink with the shrinking world, will destroy utterly the world. We are no longer in a fight with the Russians. Therefore, East and West are no longer going to fight each other. I lived in both places. I lived in Hungary. I lived on the Czechoslovakian-Hungarian border. I know the Russian system inside out. This is not just talk. I've lived there. I have known, as intimately as I know this system, I know their system. The battles of the future, therefore, lie between ethnicities of various people of various ethnic identity. And we do not have the time, nor do we have the kind of world that allows this to reach a certain point. And it cannot be transformed, it cannot be resolved unless various people have respect for each other, same respect we have for European science. If we know more about what Africans and African Americans did, it's not only the black or the African American who's transformed by this knowledge. All peoples are transformed by an awareness of what other people have contributed to the world. You take numbers, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. That's not European. That's Hindu. The world is using an Indian system to count. Europeans did not have ciphers. They had letters for numbers. Look at how the Romans counted. 1 is 1 in Roman. 2 is 1, 1. 3 is 1, 1, 1. 4 is 1V, which is the letter. I and V is the letter, and then they start again V, V1. V11, V111. You cannot enter complex mathematics like that. So the world did not become what it became as a result of one people. It is a melting and mixing of things. The air conditioner was invented by an African American, Frederick Jones. The lawn sprinkler was invented by an African American, Joseph Smith. The fire extinguisher was invented by an African American, Thomas Marshall. The guitar was invented by an African American, Robert Fleming. The letterbox was invented by an African American, Philip Downey. The iron board was invented by an African American, Sarah Boone. The fountain pen was invented by an African American, Purvis. The lawnmower was invented by an African American, John Burr. The refrigerator was invented by an African American, John Standard. The typewriter was invented by 2 African Americans, Lee Burridge and Newman Marshall. The helicopter, the first airplane to rise vertically and land vertically and hover in the air, was invented by an African American who patented it in 1929, William Hale. The first machine to mass produce shoes was invented by a black from the Caribbean, Jan Matsilega, who came to this country and was naturalized like myself. They called it the niggerhead machine. We're still using it. The first man to transform our food transport industry, we used to carry goods across the country in ice blocks. The man who invented portable refrigeration was Frederick Jones, who had also invented air conditioning. We have breakthroughs in so many other fields. You have the first gas mask by Garrett Morgan, who actually jumped into fire and saved 33 people using the gas mask for the first time, the first smoke inhalator mask. He was the man who invented the stoplight, the automatic stoplight, which we use all across the world to regulate traffic. We have other types of inventions in the field of medicine. Most of you have heard of the blood plasma. You've heard of peanut inventions. What you haven't heard is that recently blacks at Tuskegee actually invented nutrified water, developed nutrified water to enable us to grow potatoes on the moon, so that when we go in other alien environments in space, we can grow things without having earth, the kind of earth that we have here on this planet. Now, there's a whole range of these things. I only mention a few, and you will see some of them on the screen, some of the scientists and their inventions on the screen. I want, in the second half of my lecture, to go on to something that you know nothing of, and that has only become, the world has only become aware of this recently as a result of my book, BlacksInScience, which is now being used, is being translated into French. Some of it has already been translated into Russian and Hungarian and German. Because the reason I came to write this book, or edit it rather, and to pull together the material, because I began to discover that my education at London University was a bloody waste of time. I went there in the hope that I would study Africa. All of my professors, I was extraordinarily fortunate because I was the only black Britisher who was allowed into the anthropology program at that point in time. I was the only person in the British Empire at that time who was studying Bantu languages, Bantu linguistics, and anthropology. There were several people in anthropology. I shared anthropology with a dozen English students, but I was alone in my year, or in my years, in Swahili and Bantu studies. All of my professors were world authorities, and I was so respected them. You know, when you know you're being taught by a world authority, you usually come in with a certain amount of humbleness. And then you find out these people are not interested in African civilization. They're only interested in primitives. They know nothing whatsoever about the technology of Africa. Why? Because technology occurs in centers. You don't go into the bush to find technology. You cannot go into my little bush village and find out what is happening in my country. When I came out of my village at the age of 14, and I saw my sisters who I had not seen for about 12 to 14 years, they could not understand what I was saying. I was speaking a dialect that was a merger and a mix of a Native American and African and English. They did not know what on earth I was talking about. My world was different. It's the same country. So many of our professors thought you could just go anywhere in Africa, study any little insignificant, irrelevant tribe, report on it, write thousands of books about these little people, and then you have Africa. That is not true. You cannot even do it in Europe. I have lived in parts of Europe where they have never seen a black man in all history except on television. I came out of a bus and I was surrounded by 100 people who were touching me to see if my collar would come off. They had only seen blacks on television. They were not prejudiced, by the way. That was a difference. They revered me. Anything I wanted, I could have. I'd rather not say some of the things I wanted, but we will not go into that. The point was that I entered, all right, that was just a joke. I didn't want anything, okay. Okay, the point is that they lived on the periphery of the world. Western Europe, Germany and France and Britain and to some extent Spain and Portugal in the earlier period, they spread out across the world, made slaves, controlled territory. But the Europeans who were not in that situation, who did not become imperialists, who did not colonize territory, they did not have the advantage of drawing upon the wealth of others. And I went into villages in Europe where I found as many as 12 Europeans using one outhouse bathroom. They did not have flush toilets. This is the 20th century. They were using fly-infested pits. They did not have showers. They did not take showers. They went to the standpipe in the morning. They collected water and they bathed with buckets of water standing up, just as some of us in the third world, in the most devastated parts of that third world, bathe in the mornings, except, fortunate like me, I had rivers. You do not know of that, Europe, and you have no right to know of it, because that is not giving you an idea of European genius and invention and capacity and achievement. Why then should you think that learning about little savages or primitives in Africa gives you a sense of African genius? You have to go to centers in order to find out what those people were doing. In 1978, we were startled. Our scientists, Peter Schmidt and Donald Avery of Brown University in Rhode Island, discovered Africans were smelting steel 1,500 years ago. How did they find that out? They weren't going into the bush to look for steel. Who the hell needs steel in the bush? They went to center. They went to center in Tanzania, where they found the Africans had built an industrial center. And they found machines. They found 13 of these machines surviving under the earth. They found that Africans were not only producing steel in quantity, but that they had made advances that were in advance of Europe. They found the Africans were producing steel at temperatures of 1,850 degrees centigrade. No blast furnace in Europe ever achieved such temperatures until the 19th century. This they were doing in the 5th. They found that these machines, furthermore, produced the finest bloom of carbon steel in one single process. In order to produce steel in a single process, it called for a special semiconductor technology. Nobody in the world, Europe or Asia, had semiconductor technology. The Africans were using semiconductor technology, unknown in the world until the late 19th, early 20th century. Not only that, they found the Africans were using less fuel, less wood and charcoal than the Europeans. And they wondered, why would the Africans use less wood when in fact they had vast jungles? And then they discovered Africa does not have vast jungles. Africa has less jungle than where I come from in South America. It has less jungle than South America. Africa, in fact, has less jungle than any other continent comparable with its land space. That is, you can take 2 Europes and put it in Africa. There is more woodland and forest in Europe, 2 Europes, comparable with the land space of Africa. We were looking in the wrong place. That's why we didn't find the Africans had made breakthroughs in medicine. We found Africans were using aspirin centuries before us. The Bantu were using salix capen. The history of the world before these facts, which are floating around, circulating in various documents, emerge. Because even here in our living time, here are African Americans talking about their equality, and they don't even know they invented the fountain pen or air conditioning or fire extinguisher or the guitar or the refrigerator or the helicopter. They don't even know what's happening now, much less what happened before. We seem to think we live in a world where information is free and it's all floating around the place, and that is the trap. Because we do not focus on real information. We focus on all sorts of information that make people feel they're so different, either superior or inferior. A focus on wrong bodies of information, when the knowledge, real information, makes us aware that we come from one family and that we are not superior or inferior. Inferiority or superiority in academic excellence has to do with advantages and disadvantages. When I was a boy of 9, I had a terrible brain disaster. Half of my country died. We had an attack of malaria, the Anopheles mosquito. All of my friends died. I was the only survivor. And the doctors said it was pointless that I would die. There was no point doing anything about it. They put me down for dead, and the priest came and threw holy water on me, and it was rather cold, and I was burning. Those are fevers that burn your brain. And they threw water on me, and I woke up. The shock of the water woke me up. And the doctor said, well, you're going to be damaged for life, brain damage. Made all sorts of calculations about how many neurons in my brain is damaged. And my father said to me, Ivan, even if you have half a brain, you can make it. There are lots of people making it with less than half a brain around here, including the doctors. That saved my life. I said, look, for one whole year, I could not remember anything significant in my life. I had to train my memory, and then I said to myself, I read about Demosthenes, who put pebbles, because he had a list, he put pebbles on his tongue. He became the greatest orator in his world. And I said, I am going to train my memory so that nobody will be able to remember as much fact as I do. Precisely because I'm going to prove these doctors wrong. Whatever neurons are snapped, I'm going to remake them. So I want you to be aware of that. We are living in a world where information of a certain type is critical to the reconstruction of that world, not only for blacks who have to learn again to respect themselves and their history and that aspect of their legacy which is not just rooted in inferiority or deprivation, but others who have to learn to respect them through an awareness, a new awareness of their capacity and achievement. Thank you very much. Now, if you would throw the light so we could look at some of these slides very quickly. Okay. Now that is a diagrammatic representation of the smelting furnace, which I thought at first to be merely smelting iron until Schmidt and Avery discovered it was smelting steel at temperatures far in excess of that needed to smelt iron, and that this was the finest bloom of carbon steel produced in the world at that time. The Africans had an industrial center there, and we found by looking at their middens, where you have lots of things that people throw away over a period of time, we found that the level of population density there is far greater than you have in parts of Tanzania today. This is a world that was destroyed and decimated to a large extent by the invasion of other peoples. Next. This is something I did not mention in my lecture. We have found Africans more advanced in astronomy than other peoples. This is an astronomical observatory built in Kenya, East Africa, 300 years before Christ, where they found the Africans had aligned stone markers that were linked up with a range of stars and constellations, and that on the basis of the lines of these stars and constellations, they built one of the most accurate of prehistoric calendars. Next. This is a people known as the Dogon. We found that the Africans had priest astronomers. These people survive today, but they're in inhospitable mountainous region where they fled. And we found that they had plotted an invisible star, which we call Sirius B. They call it Sigipolo. This star is impossible to see with the naked eye. Yet the Africans not only saw it, they plotted its movement and orbit from 500 years ago up to the year 1990. And our machines, our best machines, show that the Africans are dead accurate. That is how it would have moved and where it would be today. Not only that, they found that the Africans had spoken of this star as being made of bright metallic iron. This star is impossible to see with the naked eye. Okay, we know now that Africans had telescopes. In 1975, the New York Times published an essay by me on its op-ed page Archaeology's discovery of an African presence in America, which they subtitled Bad News for Columbus. And it was read all over the world, and eventually I got a letter from Russia, from academician Sanarov, of one of the Russian science cities in Asia, where the Russians said that they were working on migrations from the Pacific, not just the Bering Straits migrations, but migrations, say, of Japanese in Ecuador, which I mentioned in my book, They Came Before Columbus, and that they wanted to exchange information with me because they did not know anything about the Atlantic migrations. They wanted to know what were the nature of these researches that established Atlantic movements. And during our communication, academician Sanarov informed me that one of their scientists, Bolosimo, had discovered perfectly ground spherical crystal lenses in ancient Africa, leading them to the conclusion that the Africans had telescopes. Whether the Dogon invented their own telescopes or got it during their trade with the Egyptians during the black-dominated period, that we do not know. But we know that they were able to point to the fact that there was an object flashing and darkening, contracting and expanding within the region of this star. NASA discovered its object about 4 years ago, found again the Africans were dead accurate. We found it with our spaceship. The Einstein orbiting satellite discovered the object the Africans had been talking about for centuries. The Africans actually danced the orbit of the star. They showed it had a 50-year orbit around its parent star, Sirius A, and an orbit of 1 year on its own axis. We had hoped the Hubble telescope would have been able to tell us whether the Africans were correct about the 1 year orbit. Unfortunately, NASA made 2 mirrors, and they did not test the second one, which is the better mirror, and now we have a crippled telescope, which we may not be able to correct for many years. We do not know whether we'll be able to correct it, but we will not be able to tell whether the Africans were correct about the 1 year orbit. But we have established it does have the 50-year orbit around Sirius A, and we have found the Einstein orbiting satellite found that the object that we're talking about flashing and darkening is a dwarf nova. These people, there are 3 books written about them. 2 have recently been translated into English. The Pale Fox and Conversations with Ogotomeli, but the 3rd one is still in French. Next. This is the cesarean section I spoke about among the Banyuru surgeons. It was reported in the Edinburgh Medical Journal. Next. This is one of the walls at Zimbabwe, the stone city of Zimbabwe, and which housed about 10,000 people, and at that time that was quite a size for a city. This has a type of bonding which we still do not understand, which we find among the Africans, both in Egypt and here in Zimbabwe. Next. This is from the conical tower in Zimbabwe. You could stand at that tower 800 years ago and look down in the valley 30 miles beneath and see the slightest flicker of a soldier or merchant in the valley beneath. Next. This is from boat technology. Many Europeans had given the impression that the Africans were only making canoes. We have found, in fact, a range of ships made by Africans both on the Niger and the Nile. And that the canoe, the so-called canoe, was only a basic building block or template for expansion and extension techniques. Next. Here you see large canoes carrying 3 camels aboard ship. Next. But a range of other ships existed, stone plank boats. This is a boat that was used by Africans 1,000 years before Christ. This is used on the Indian Ocean. This is known as the Mtepe. They also have the Dula Mtepe, which uses both oars and sail, so that when the sail is not relevant, they use the oars. This has the shape of some early Egyptian and Phoenician vessels. The Africans were so skilled in sailing in certain places, though not in others, that one of the captains of an African people known as the Sidis was made an admiral of the Indian Ocean by the Mughals out of respect for their shipping. Also, the Chinese report Africans bringing elephants to them in ships 200 years before Columbus. Next. This is the papyrus reed boat which Haidar had rebuilt by the Buduma people under Abdullah Jibrin, which crossed the Atlantic in 1969, showing that such a boat could travel on the ocean. Scientists at first scoffed. They said, you can't take a papyrus reed boat and put it on the ocean. Heyerdahl insisted that the sweep of the boat, the way it was made, its sail, etc., indicated that they were involved in ocean travel. And scientists said, if you take papyrus reed and put it in the ocean, it would get waterlogged and sink. And so they took some papyrus reed and they put it in a lap tank and it sank. And Heyerdahl said, if I took a piece of the Queen Mary, which is made of iron, and put it in a tank, it would also sink. So this boat was built and it actually crossed the Atlantic successfully in 1969. So using current power, the rudder broke on the first day. There are 3 currents from Africa that take you automatically into the Americas. Europe does not have the advantage of those currents. Next. Here are the currents. They've been in that ocean for thousands of years. They haven't changed. They come out from the Cape Verde, off the Senegambia coast, off the southern coast of Africa, moving towards South America, and going on into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Next. That shows you how Africa was linked up before the fragmentation of the slave trade, all the way from Cairo. Next. This shows you a map that was published in my book, They Came Before Columbus. This is one of the irrefutable proofs that Africans were here before Columbus, because this map was found in the Sac Library of Alexandria in Egypt. This map shows the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates between the African Atlantic coast and the South American Atlantic coast. No map drawn before the 20th century so accurately shows the connection between Africa and South America, and it has parts of the Caribbean. Nobody at the time of Columbus and 200 years after Columbus could have drawn such a map. The encyclopedias of Europe report that 150 years after Columbus, Europeans could not link latitude with longitude. In fact, people said that longitude had not been discovered and was probably undiscoverable. They knew latitude but not longitude. Let me quote Columbus's actual words. Columbus struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India. That's why this place was called India. It wasn't called America. That's why we're calling the Americans Indians. Columbus said, I have 8 or 9 pilots aboard the ships, and they're like blind men. My pilots are so ignorant, I am not sure they can find again the lands I have discovered. Unquote. This shows with tremendous scientific accuracy. It's only about 1 degree off. Maps drawn for hundreds of years are many degrees off. This was found in 1513 by a Moorish Admiral Piri Reis, but it could not have been drawn in 1513 in the light of what was available at that time. Next. This is, these are early agricultural settlements in Africa, which are shown at Wadi Kubania and Wadi Tushka, which are shown to be thousands of years before agricultural settlements elsewhere. Next. First, mortar and pestles for grinding grain at Wadi Kubania. Next. This is the electric light. This is the patent by Louis Latimer showing the first carbon filament. He also wrote the first book on incandescent electric lighting. He also drew the telephone for Graham Bell. Next. This is Latimer. Next. This is the shoe lasting machine invented by Jan Matsulega, who, like myself, naturalized American from the Caribbean. Next. This is the graphite lubricator invented by Elijah McCoy, which transformed the mechanical industry. This is the first machine to lubricate itself. It was particularly necessary in the locomotive industry where we had superheated engines. Next. This is railway induction telegraphy by Granville Woods. Next. This is the Rillieux evaporator. This machine, invented by West Indian Norbert Rillieux, who came to the United States. This machine transformed the economy of England and France. This is the first machine to make sugar crystals, to transform cane juice into sugar crystals. Next. This is Jones, Frederick Jones. He's responsible for the invention of air conditioning as well as portable refrigeration. Next. This is Dr. Lloyd Quarterman. who changed uranium-235 into uranium-238 and contributed to the development of the atomic bomb. He worked on the Manhattan Project under Einstein. He also did his quantum mechanics under Enrico Fermi in Chicago. So he's responsible for the destructive as well as the constructive uses of the atom. He also invented the diamond window. He was also the first person to develop synthetic blood. The Japanese have it now. The Americans cut his funds, so he never pushed on with synthetic blood. Next. This is the glass fiber light guides. I pointed to the various scientists in New Jersey, Cannon and Northover and Richardson, who were responsible for major breakthroughs in this field. Next. This is James West, who co-invented foil electrodes, who's transformed our electronics industry, particularly with regard to tape recorders. Next. There he is in the quietest room in the world. This is known as the anechoic chamber. Here you can hear a pin drop. Next. This is Major Guillaume Defoe, who was in charge of our space shuttle program and who saw the first space shuttle from babyhood to blast off. Next. This is Dr. George Carruthers, who invented the most advanced camera to go into outer space. This was taken out on Apollo, the first trip to the moon. This is the camera that took the first picture of this planet from the moon, the first picture of the solar system from the moon. It is known as ultraviolet ray spectrograph. Next. This is Colonel Gregory, who piloted as well as commanded the spaceship, two separate ships. Next. This is the cockpit or brain of the space shuttle. This is the first cockpit, which had great flaws. Colonel Gregory was chosen to redesign the cockpit of the 80s. Next. This is him sitting blind. This is not the sky, sitting blind in the middle of an aeroplane, landing it on the point of a pin without looking through the window. I would not like to be in that experiment. Anyway, it worked. And it will be used in most of our aircraft by the end of this century. Next. This is the alternate power controller, which is also invented by Gregory, which cuts power fatigue in half, which cuts pilot fatigue in half. Sorry. Next. This is me meeting Colonel Gregory 6 years ago at Cape Kennedy. Next. This is the moon buggy. Bob Sherney was responsible for building the tires for the moon buggy, an African engineer at NASA. These tires are collapsible. They're metal plates. They're not like the tires on Earth. They had to meet several problems, how to carry this machine across the crystalline, jagged surface of the moon, which has the 1/5 the gravity of Earth. Next. This is the KC-135-09 aircraft, which flying a parabolic curve achieves weightlessness. This is Bob Shern, the machine who spent more time in states of weightlessness than any American astronaut except those who went up on rather long journeys. He invented, as I say, the tires in the moon buggy, the first space toilet, etc. And he's tested a great number of machines. This is known as the vomit comet. This is the point at which weightlessness is achieved, and you see everything floating. Next. This is Dr. Christine Darden, who's head of our hypersonic research program at NASA. Next. And finally, this is me presenting a copy of my book, Blacks in Science, to what at that time was our latest astronaut. He's recently gone up. He went up to put the Hubble telescope into space. Charles Bolden, he's now a colonel. I was giving him a copy of Blacks in Science so he wouldn't get lost in space. Thank you very much.